Okay, hi there. Welcome to a special video looking at some of the key barriers or constraints on economic development for lower and lower middle income countries. The video is targeted for students preparing for their A-level economics papers in the summer of 2018. There's a huge amount we can cover here. I'm going to try to be very specific about particular development barriers to help your exam prospects. I'm drawing first of all on the work of Paul Collier, the eminent development economist from Oxford University. He's developed what he identifies as 4 development traps, including conflict, the impact of civil war and battles over resources. Countries might be over-reliant on primary products such as extracting oil and gas and coal and other minerals from underneath the ground. Another trap is being landlocked with bad neighbours. And also a key barrier is countries where the standards of government, standards of democracy, the quality of institutions is not sufficiently good to protect property rights and allow economies to flourish. Now we're going to cover some of these in the next 10 or 15 minutes, and I want to take you through very specific development traps. Here's the latest data on the Human Development Index. I'm sure you've covered this as part of your revision for the exam, and these were the countries at the top there, including the Central African Republic and Niger and Chad, that are ranked lowest, in other words have the highest ranking number in terms of human development. Low life expectancy, big gap between expected and mean years of schooling, and a very low level of gross national income per capita, even making adjustment for PPP. Contrast with the countries in the second half of the table there who are right at the top of the human development ladder. So let's go through, if you bear with me, some of the very specific development barriers that you need to be able to mention in an exam. The first one is called the savings gap. The savings gap. What does that mean? Well, if you think about the Howard-Domar model, savings are needed to help finance capital investment. And in many smaller, low-income countries, high levels of extreme poverty, that's people living on less than $1.90 per day, PPP, that high level of extreme poverty makes it almost impossible for households and businesses to generate enough savings to fund capital investment. Therefore, countries with a savings gap are more reliant on foreign aid or perhaps borrowing money from overseas. In Africa, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, savings rates of around 15-18% of GDP compare with over 30% for middle-income countries. And basically a low level of saving, allied to poorly developed, perhaps incomplete financial markets, makes it very expensive for businesses and for governments in these countries to get the funds they need at an interest rate they can afford to fund their investment. This chart's revealing. This chart is the latest data from the World Bank. Can you see here the dark blue line? That shows the remittance, the money flowing to developing countries from overseas aid, ODA, overseas development assistance. And back in the early 1990s, that was the most significant form of external finance for developing countries. It has grown, but it's been overtaken significantly by foreign direct investment. So FDI is a way of overcoming, in part, the savings gap. And it's also been overtaken by remittances, money coming in from migrant workers from overseas, as well as private debt and portfolio equity, borrowing money, etc. So these are the key sources of external finance coming into developing countries to help overcome the savings gap. The savings gap is the first of our major barriers to development. The second one I'd like to focus on is capital flight. Capital flight. Now that is when we have uncertain and big movements of money, financial capital out of a country. So this is when, for example, investors lose confidence in a country or a government and try to get their money out of their financial system. Could be many reasons for this: political turmoil, a risk of civil conflict, perhaps a fear that the government plans to take business assets under state control. They could nationalise some assets. Oftentimes capital flight is caused by exchange rate uncertainty. Perhaps investors fear a devaluation of the currency, or they think that the country's banking system is fragile and could be under threat. Corruption is a key factor, and billions of dollars every year are taken out of countries illegally, especially in countries where corruption is high. So why is capital flight a barrier to development? Well, because fundamentally capital flight undermines the stability of the financial system, which is important for long-term development. And it also leads to a weaker currency. Now, a weaker currency can make your exports more competitive, but if capital flight causes the currency to collapse, that increases the price of imports, including essential goods such as components and food. And it also, crucially, makes it harder and more expensive for a country to finance their external debts. So capital flight is a barrier that's worth revising for the exam. Another barrier is the financial system. Many developing countries don't have robust, resilient, inclusive, accessible financial sectors. This chart shows, for example, the percentage of females that own a transaction account, a savings account, and it's very, very high in Singapore and in China and in South Africa, but look all the way down. Less than 50% of females have a bank account in India. In Pakistan, it's less than 5%. In Yemen, it's less than 2%. According to the World Bank, over 2 billion working age adults don't use formal financial services. That could be a bank account to save, it could be access to a loan, it could be access to basic insurance, for example. And in particular, this financial exclusion applies to women in the least developed countries. The inaccess to financial services often pushes people away from the formal banking sector towards informal loans, very high interest loans, and of course it does create a funding problem for people who want to perhaps start a business. Microfinance is perhaps one way to partially overcome this barrier. My third barrier is infrastructure. We sometimes call this the infrastructure gap. So in many, many countries, including developed nations as well, the level or the state of the infrastructure is a big factor holding back development. Infrastructure gaps limit growth and development in all kinds of different ways. First of all, they increase the cost of getting goods to market. So if supply costs go up, that increases prices, and higher prices reduces the real income of consumers. Weak infrastructure makes workers less geographically mobile and can therefore lead to higher structural unemployment. Poor infrastructure is a factor holding back trade. It increases the costs of trade and therefore can limit intra-regional trade within a continent or trade between countries and regions. Weak infrastructure can make a country less attractive to foreign direct investment. And also, of course, it makes a country more vulnerable to coping with the effects of climate change. And weak infrastructure, again, is linked to gender inequality. Access to absolutely core public services, for example, can be regarded as part of the infrastructure of a country. My next barrier is the human capital barrier. Now, this, to my mind, is perhaps the most important, most significant development policy issue that one can think about. Human capital is absolutely essential for development. We define it as the skill, the knowledge, the talent, the experience and the ability of workers. In other words, we're trying to increase the quality of the human input of production. And again, I've put in here some of the countries least able to provide that for their citizens. These are the countries at the bottom end, towards the bottom end of the life of the Human Development Index, and in particular, these are the countries with the lowest mean or average actual years of schooling. Staggeringly low levels. Globally, more than 260 million children and youth are not in school. And in fact, 60% of primary school children in developing countries fail to achieve minimum proficiency in learning. So human capital is absolutely crucial. And with countries that do well in terms of turning, for example, the wealth that lies underneath the ground into the wealth that lies above the ground, can turn natural capital into human capital, will do really well. According to the World Bank, between 10 and 30% of differences in per capita incomes across countries can be attributed to differences in human capital. So it's really about targeting why it is that human capital doesn't improve in some countries as much as it should. Some parents, for example, underinvest in their children because of social norms. It's about providing the infrastructure and the accessibility and the affordability of education and training. Absolutely critical to overcoming this barrier. And another major barrier to development is the relative absence in some countries of property rights. Now, why are property rights important for development? Well, first of all, the right to own land, top left-hand corner there of the slide, the right to own land and to establish a business is seen as crucial for a country to generate wealth. So, for example, people who have the right to own a private plot to start farming and feeding their own family, then starting to trade the surplus. If you have very strong institutions, including the judiciary, that is prepared to protect the rule of law, for example, that can be a major barrier to endemic corruption. Property rights are also important to tackle gender inequalities. We need good institutions and good property rights amongst the community so they can look after natural resources and overcome threats to ecosystems, overcome threats to the tragedy of the commons. We need property rights to encourage businesses and people to be innovative, so they create a patent, for example, they can protect their intellectual property rights, so then they can secure the investment in research as well as the returns from research. And crucially, actually, you need rules of trade rules, to encourage trade and investment between countries. We're seeing that, of course, in the Brexit discussions at the moment, trying to come to complex decisions about the rules under which trade takes place. Now, in many countries, property rights are not well established, they're not well protected. It's worth bearing that in mind and understanding the significance for development outcomes. Linked with this is corruption. Corruption is a significant development barrier. This chart shows the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. These are the countries on the planet with the highest level of corruption. So Somalia and South Sudan and North Korea had the dubious distinction of coming top of this list. Corruption is nearly always due to a failure of governing institutions who lack transparency, both in terms of where their tax revenues are coming from and how tax revenues and resources are spent. And high levels of corruption clearly damage growth and development. They inhibit foreign direct investment. They lead to allocative inefficiency. They divert scarce resources away from people who might benefit towards people just for their own private gains. Corruption contributes to persistent wealth and income inequality. It causes a loss of trust. It causes people not to trust each other when there's a lot of corruption. And basically, corruption, of course, limits the amount of tax revenue that's coming in. And if governments aren't collecting enough tax revenue, they don't have enough money to spend on public services and perhaps a welfare state. So corruption is really important as a barrier. As are brain drains. So in many countries, you may well get a question in the data response where a nation experiences a brain drain, a loss of population. Again, this table shows the countries with the highest net migration rate, outward migration per 1,000 people. Clearly, events in Syria and Libya have been, geopolitical events, and the civil war there have had a huge effect in terms of displacement of population. But there are many disadvantages for people leaving. There's just a loss of human capital from the economy that damages the long-term supply side potential. You may lose your most enterprising younger workers who might have started up a business at home, for example. You lose skilled workers, so you might lose doctors and teachers. That might have affected Human Development Index outcomes. There's the loss of aggregate demand from a shrinking population, which in turn makes a country less attractive to inward investment. And there's some arguments for saying that if you lose your younger skilled workers, countries become less innovative, and innovation is crucial for competitiveness. So the brain drain effect is certainly worth a look at. Gender inequality is something the World Bank and many institutions are particularly concerned with. This table shows countries with the worst gender inequality according to the latest gender inequality adjusted HDI data. And we measure it by things like maternal mortality ratios, the adolescent birth rate, percentage of the female population compared to males who have at least some secondary education, and the participation in the labour market. We think it's true that no society can achieve its potential without the full and equal participation of women and men. According to the United Nations Human Development Report last year, all too often women and girls are discriminated against in health, in education, political representation and the labour market, with negative repercussions for development of their capabilities and their freedom of choice. We have over 60 million girls in the world not in school. Over 150 countries in the world have at least one law that acts as a barrier to female participation in the labour market. The percentage of women who occupy parliamentary seats is less than a quarter globally, although that has increased in recent times. Gender inequality is a barrier because we're not making full, productive, dynamic use of vast amounts of our population. So crucially, there's a role for the state in overcoming some of these barriers. Some economists believe in the power of the state in terms of addressing market failures and of intervening directly to affect development outcomes. Basic universal healthcare, providing accessible, affordable education, building or helping to fund the building of essential infrastructure, providing core public goods that perhaps the market doesn't provide, better institutions, bringing public-private partnerships in to support smart urbanisation, having an active industrial policy to develop manufacturing, for example, perhaps progressive taxation and state spending. So those people on the left who regard the state as an absolutely key part of development often talk about the developmental state as an agent able to overcome some of the barriers we've talked about. On the other hand, a different point of view is the free market approach. Some economists argue that actually instead of the state being the main provider and facilitator of development, the free market, the private sector, should be given more of a role to play. Countries like Estonia and Chile have adopted more of a free market agenda. So liberalise the economy, control of budget deficits, take away subsidies, less subsidies which distort the market, widen the base of taxation, lower income tax rates to encourage enterprise, let the financial markets set their own interest rates, let the exchange rate find its own level, reduce trade barriers and shift resources from the state into the private sector. You can see here the gap, the difference between the state approach and the free market or so-called market-led approach to development. But our focus in this video has been about development barriers. It's important to go into the exam with a really clear list of, let's say, half a dozen particular barriers to development. You can bring these into your discussion. You may be able to identify in the extracts in your daily response questions some of these barriers, and then you can bring them as part of into your analysis and evaluate how they might be overcome. Good luck in your papers, everybody, and thanks for joining in on this video.